Welcome to Face to Face. This is a show about change and about what's next. It's a show that wants to ask questions, peel back the layers of our average everyday experience, and go beyond scratching the surface. We interview amazing people with incredible ideas and stories who have done wild, weird, and wonderful things. Remember that imagination shared creates collaboration, and collaboration creates community, and community inspires social change. I'm David Peck, and this is Face to Face. Well, welcome to another edition of Face to Face. We are here today on live. Well, probably not live for you, the listener, but live on Queen Street East, I believe, at the Verity Club, and we are here to chat with Frank Soriano. Thanks for joining us today,
Thanks
Frank.
for asking me, David.
Yeah. So, Frank, I'm gonna let Frank tell us a little bit about what he does and who he is and so on. He's a consultant, but he's a leadership consultant. He's, I'm guessing, a bit of a writer, speaker, and a change maker of one kind or another. So that's certainly, I think those are all good reasons for why we're chatting here together today. So, Frank, why don't you tell us maybe a little bit about what it is you do? Okay. And I'm not gonna restrict you to the 30-second elevator speech.
Sure.
I may interrupt you from time to time, but yeah, tell us a little bit more about what you're up to.
David, let me give you a little bit of context around that. I should tell you that I recently have become self-employed as a consultant / keynote speaker.
Was that by design, Frank?
Circumstances came together, and I'll explain that because I think that's important.
Yeah.
So I had worked 30 years for the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board. I originally took a job there as a rehab counselor, a rehabilitation counselor, because I felt I wanted to make a difference in the lives of people at that level. And so I wanted to work with people who had been injured on the job. And that's how I started out with the WSIB. I then became a training specialist after 5 years of doing that. And then after being a training specialist for 5 years, I thought I should cross over into the dark side and get a job in management. Which I did, and I spent 10 years in management. In the last 10 years at the WSIB, I became part of human resources and worked as an internal consultant focusing on leadership development. And so that's my 30-year history there. The important question, as you mentioned, though, is why did I end up leaving? And after 30 years, there comes a time when you have to sort of embrace your work and try to take it out to a larger audience, which I wanted to do. But I will also say that corporate entities often have a change in upper management, and the nature of the organization was such that they weren't paying as much attention to leadership development as I thought they should. I think leadership is something that we never get tired of talking about. There is no panacea or silver bullet, and different people have different understandings of what leadership is and what great leadership should involve. And so I wanted to take my work and I guess sort of cater to a larger audience, if I can put it that way. So the last couple of years, to your point earlier, I have been writing a book actually.
Oh, okay.
And
good.
I actually have a manuscript as we speak, and it's about 50,000 words, and it's really sort of my thoughts over the last 10 years on what great leadership is, what leaders should focus on. I've come up with 6 questions that I think every leader needs to be able to answer for themselves. But leadership to me is not reflective of a position, it's reflective of a mindset. And so whether you hold a formal leadership position or not, I think it's all incumbent on us to demonstrate leadership behaviors.
Yeah, I saw something in you're either on your site or in your promotional material, and you almost imply as if we all have a responsibility to lead in one way or another.
Yes.
And I think that's something we probably should unpack. So you're writing a book, and listen, this is, don't take me the wrong way, but hasn't it all been said before? For crying out loud! I mean, is there anything else after Dale Carnegie? Is there anything else after Stephen Covey? Really?
I asked myself that
the 7 habits.
I asked myself that very same question, and I remember reading a book called The Wisdom of Teams, and those 2 authors started off with the same thought. Is there anything more that can be said about teams?
Yeah.
And they said, but we decided to write the book anyway, and I guess I've taken the same approach. I think that sometimes it's not what you say, but it's how you say it. And these days, I think it's very important for people to be able to relate to what you're saying on a more personal level. So I will tell you that some of my epiphanies have been related in relation to bringing up my children. and some of the stories that my father told me as a child. Some of the examples I use are not from corporate life. They're very personal examples because, as you just pointed out, leadership is everyone's responsibility. So how does this material and information actually influence our day-to-day lives?
Do you think that there's something to, I mean, I'm with you 100%, and sometimes, some of the questions I ask will be, of you and of others are just to not stir it up. I was once accused of being argumentative by a professor, and I was emotionally hurt by that. And because I don't consider myself at all argumentative. Stylistically, maybe I can come across that way. If your face is red and you're standing on your feet, maybe that's a bit argumentative. But really, for me, it's about trying to get to the bottom of it.
Yes.
And what is it that is really fundamentally affecting this kind of change, or what is it that's causing the issue, or so it's about problem solving. But I think it even goes deeper than just problem solving. To me, is very mechanical and anti-relational on some level. So I love what you say about some of the stories that your father has told you or told you along the way. I have a 6 and an 8-year-old, and I was talking to my wife Elizabeth just recently about the memories that we're creating for them and how important they're going to be. And just even last night, I've got a set of walkie-talkies, and Spencer has one in his bedroom, and I have one downstairs, and I'm giving him updates on the hockey game while he's in bed. And so I go, Elizabeth, yeah, he's not going to get a great sleep over the next 2 weeks, but he will never forget this.
No, that's true. He'll remember.
Is that not
yes? That is what makes the difference.
Those little bits of business, right? So you're taking that
Yes.
And coming up with the 3 steps
Yes.
of, or the 5 steps of, or is it are these stories metaphors?
Well, some of them are metaphors, and some of them, for example, I love fairy tales. I suspect that you probably do as well.
I do, actually. I'm reading one right now that Victoria gave me, and I can't remember the title of it, which I'm sorry about. But I am reading a story about the some pearls and fairy tales. Yeah, or fairies.
There's much to learn from
there
fairy
is,
tales,
yeah.
right? And so stories are stories are stories.
It's great. It's a great line, by the way.
What's that?
There's much to learn from fairy tales.
I think it was Albert Einstein who said, if you want your children to be brilliant, read them fairy tales. If you want them to be even more brilliant, read them more fairy tales. And so I guess that always stuck with me. But some of the stories are very pragmatic and very practical, and some of them are very metaphorical. I can tell you a very quick story about my son that kind of proves a point. And so you probably know about the ladder of inference, I think, developed by Chris Argyris, and you see an event and it affects you in a different way. We make our beliefs, we act accordingly, et cetera, et cetera. But the relevance of that didn't hit me until one day I was at my parents' house and we had lunch, and my son was playing cards with my father. My father, of course, was 80 at the time. My son was 9 or 10. And my father was winning the whole time, and my father said to my son, because he felt badly for him, he said, Jonathan, you're a very good loser. And my son didn't say anything, but as we walked out the door, I could see he was somewhat upset. I said, Jonathan, what's the matter? He said, well, Nono thinks I'm good at losing. And I said, no, he was trying to pay you a compliment, but he didn't understand that idiomatic expression, and so he took that out of context. And so we tend to see the same event, whatever it may be, but we apply different understandings. And I think that sometimes, to your point about being argumentative, of course, I'm of Italian descent, so confrontation is just, a byproduct of my upbringing.
Or too much red wine.
Oh, yeah, or too much red wine, or both.
It's those Barolos.
Yeah. But I think that we need to understand, and I think intelligent people need to understand. So I don't think it's a matter of an argument. I think it's a matter of having understanding, and if it sounds like an argument.
So I love all that, and I'd love to get back to that story, because I think there's a lesson there for all of us, more than one lesson as well. But I forever go on about this rate at quite a rate about polarization, up and down and black and white, and perspective. Really, well, it's all about perspective. But do we really believe that? Like, you hear that all the time, right?
Sure.
You hear, well, that's your perspective.
Sure.
But I just wonder if, when it comes to working through issues, political issues, social issues in the world, relational issues, husbands, wives, partners, and so on. I don't, and maybe that's why you're writing a new book.
Well, David, that's a very good point. And actually, what we believe is an extension of what we think. And so when I often give a keynote, I tell them that my purpose here is to have us think about our thinking. Right? What is it that you think that leads you to believe what you believe, and then based on your beliefs you behave in a certain manner? So again, I'll go to leadership. I talk about the mental model of leadership. I mean, people often think, okay, leadership, position, power, etc., etc. My my definition of leadership, and I ask people what would be the one word to describe leadership if I was an alien who landed on the planet, what would that word be? And invariably people go to strategist, decision maker, motivator, inspirer, hero, whatever. My word for leadership is educator. And the reason I use educator is because an educator takes someone from a place of not knowing to a place of knowing, from a place of not doing to a place of doing, and from a place of not being to a place of being. And that is actually very important because it speaks to the culture of an organization, to the culture of a family, to the culture of a community. So it's based on what you think, how what you believe, how you behave.
Is this why you think we all have a responsibility as a leader?
Yes.
Because there's that, I mean, we're all educators on some level, I suppose. Or are you formalizing it more and saying this person, twice a week has a board meeting and calls people in and we sit down in a room and educates them? Or are you talking about a whole other level?
I think at a whole different level. I think on a day-to-day basis, there is an opportunity for demonstrating leadership based on that definition, and that's why I think everyone has that responsibility. I don't think you have to wait for a meeting, or I don't think you have to meet with certain people. I don't think I need to tell you that even as a parent, you're a leader and / educator, as you just pointed out.
So you're teaching, I mean, is that something you say in your talks, in your writing and so on, that we are teaching all the time, therefore be on your guard, therefore watch what you say, therefore ask the right questions?
Absolutely. It's about raising your level of what I call self-awareness / other awareness. And so one of the things that I'm sure you've come across is people always talk about the importance of relationships, and they say, well, you should have good relationships.
It's such a cliche, Frank, that I actually think in some ways it's meaningless now. Oh, it's all about relationships, right?
Yeah, but having said that, though, what exactly is involved in establishing a relationship?
That's right.
So it's not just one thing. It's not just about trust. It's not just about conversation.
Yep.
I've developed a model that I call the business relationship model, and it talks about 5 things. So it talks about / other awareness. It talks about trust, effective conversation, collaboration, and feedback. I think you need all of those things based on a systems thinking approach in order to have effective relationships. But I don't think that people intentionally set out to say, how can I improve this relationship, even though they know that there may be something lacking in the relationship.
What do you think? What do you think about the digital world we're living in right now? You and I seem to be fairly similar ages.
Yes.
Do you think that it's developing healthy workplace relationships? Do you think it's fostering better marriages and so on? I mean, I just came out of a family weekend, and at one point I made a note, there was one person reading a book and there was about 9 of us in the room and 8 of us were on a device.
Yeah.
8 of us. Now, we also played soccer and corkle and ate meals together and had a great time, right? Yeah. But it just was, man, if somebody had taken a camera or and got an image of that, they'd say, wow, these guys got issues.
Well, David, you see that all the time, and I'll be very candid. I think this technology has, on some level, dehumanized our relationships because there's no substitute for face-to-face conversation, and I'm sure you probably know this as well. I mean, there's something to be said about looking a person in the eye, about how they deliver the message, their body language. There are a whole bunch of intangible things that cannot be picked up by your electronic device. Mm-hmm. And the danger there lies is that, everyone has a BlackBerry or an iPhone, and they seem to be consumed with this information. No one is that important. I tell this story about going to a confirmation, and Father John says, could you please turn off your cellular devices because God won't be texting you during the service,
right,
and probably not afterwards.
Right.
No one is that important. I don't think that anyone is so important that you can't spend time having a conversation with the person who's sitting right there in front of you, because right now, at this moment, you're the most important person to me. It doesn't matter how many text messages I'm getting or whatever information is coming on my iPhone. You are the most important person to me. And I think I should show you that kind of respect and vice versa.
I remember years ago, my cousin's girlfriend at the time, a long time ago, I probably told this story before on a podcast, but we were there, she was coming to pick up some information about U2. Mm-hmm. I'm a huge U2 fan, always have been, so I had several books and all their albums, and I don't know, who knows, maybe I had an interview. I know. I said, okay, now I'm going to just show that I'm a bit of a lunatic here, but I subscribed to their magazine called Propaganda back in the day. And so I was giving her some sources for some articles she was writing for school project. We were standing in the kitchen, living in Mississauga, and her and I, don't even remember her name, and the phone rang. And I completely ignored it. And we kept our conversation going, and she left. And this is pre-internet, and this was pre-BlackBerry and so on, and device. And a couple days later, my cousin called me and said, "Holy cow, you blew her away, by the way, when you guys were in your conversation in the kitchen and the phone rang and you ignored it." She just assumed that as soon as, but a couple things there going on. A, that communicated that to her, and B, that my cousin took the time and effort to actually tell me that.
Right.
So to this day, unless it's a really important phone call, and when I say really important, it's got to be Bono calling, or the World Bank, or my mother, in that order, I think.
Yeah.
I'm not answering the phone if I've got family over. And I think, I don't want to become the old fart, Frank, that says technology is killing us all and so on.
No, there's wonderful benefits to technology. I think we'd agree on that.
Yeah.
But to your point, the very fact that you did that, I think demonstrates how much the relationship meant to you. Like if you're not distracted, if you're not taken away by the guy knocking on your door, arranging your golf game, or picking up the phone, or looking out the window, or sending an email while you're talking to someone.
You're talking to them. Yeah.
That's absurd.
It is absurd, and it's kind of like if you say, you're making a choice, right? And if you say no to one thing, you're saying yes to another, and vice versa. So if you're sitting there, typing an email while you're trying to have a conversation with somebody, you're communicating more than just through email.
You're giving them a message.
I know,
and the message is not a good one.
Oh yeah, no, and I'm slapping the back of my hand right now too many times, but hopefully getting better at it all the time. So you're into you speak on the leadership, relationships, and systems thinking.
Yes.
So tell me a bit. So as the philosopher, the fly in the ointment here, systems thinking sounds kind of anti-relational. Sounds kind of mathematical and Cartesian and okay, Frank, let's get that big graph up there on the PowerPoint and show me the stats, give me the numbers.
Okay. Well,
how do you fight back against that?
It's funny that you mentioned the Cartesian thinking, because it was René Descartes who said, "I think, therefore I am," right? And he influenced the thinking of society for almost 300 years because he felt
still does, I think, in a huge way.
He does in a huge way. He felt the universe was a giant clock, and if we broke down all the parts of the clock and understood how they worked, we would understand, what the clock does. Systems thinking, and it's a relatively new term, and I say relatively because it's about 100 years old, is really contingent on the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. But in order for the whole to be greater than the sum of its parts, all of the parts have to be working well, but also the relationship between the parts have to be working well. So it's actually much more focused on relationships than one would think just based on the way it sounds, right? So if any part of my system, so if I go back to my model about the various parts, I may be very good at giving feedback, I may be very collaborative, I might be able to have great conversations, but if people don't trust me, my relationships are still going to suffer. Like all of those component parts, whatever they may be, whatever parts of the system are at play, have to be working well, and also the relationship between the parts have to be well.
What do you say to people and managers and leaders who go, this is all great, but and we'd love for you to come and speak to us, but we don't have time to actually implement any of this.
Yeah.
It's great, it sounds lovely, and we'll buy your book even, but what do you do with that? Because I look at your model, and it's great, and you go, who has time for that?
Yeah.
And by the way, didn't you get that when you were born anyway? Isn't that kind of a part of who you are? There's a lot of questions there.
And you know what? Those are all great questions. And I'll say this. Most people are born thinking they can have a conversation. Everyone is born knowing they can talk. Very few people are able to have a conversation. So a conversation is reciprocal in nature, as you probably know.
There's an intimacy there.
There is.
Yeah.
And most people don't know how to have conversation. But for leaders who often say, we don't have time for this, and in fact that happens quite a bit, and that's probably part of the reason why I left corporate life, is because, I'll be honest with you, over the last 10 years working as an internal consultant, we had 3 different leadership strategies. They're good for a couple of years, and then senior leaders say, you know what, we're too busy here, or we're swept away by the business, let's redraft our strategy and start something else. So the bottom line for me is, unless you're willing to participate in this kind of exercise, you need to devote the time. And yes, it is time consuming, but clearly if things are not working well, what are you planning to do about that? right? So you can't basically go through life writing a new leadership strategy every 2 or 3 years. You need to sort of like dig in and keep the momentum going, sustain the momentum. I sometimes tell people, can you afford not to do this? Right? I mean, that's the bottom line.
Yeah, I've always liked that, and I'm using that more and more. Not, can you afford not to do it? What's the downside? And why wouldn't you? So somebody will say to me, so why, David, why do you do the work you do? And I've often come back with, well, I think a better question is, why aren't you doing that same kind of work? Because there's something, I think, you can tell a lot about a person by the nature of the questions they ask, it seems to me. And that's part of the reason why I chose to study philosophy. And I should have a T-shirt with that on it, actually. Systems thinking is organizational culture. You're getting involved with human resource departments and org charts, and you're talking about office dynamics and the ethos of an organization and closed door policy and all these things. So if it truly is all interconnected, and that's kind of what I'm hearing from you, you've got 4 out of the 5, or you got 9 out of the 10. What if you just can't get that ninth thing? The trust has been so broken down because there's some sort of, aging founder who won't let go. There is a clique mentality that is so deeply seated. The last thing I'm going to do is trust anyone. Because, it's kind of that house of cards approach, right? The political kind of, they're all liars, right? I don't trust any of them, and I just got to survive.
A couple of things come to mind. So there are systems within systems. There's no hierarchy. So depending on where you find yourself in the system, so if I can use a very concrete example, if I'm a vice president, I'm going to have more influence at the vice presidential level than if I'm a frontline manager who wants to influence the thinking of the vice president. I do believe that managers, if I can use that example again, are able to create a culture within the larger organizational culture. So there's a subculture within the culture. The way I set up my team dynamics, if I'm a systems thinker, and by the way, David, if I was just able to influence people to think, if I can take a systems thinking approach, which means there's got to be interdependencies here on this problem that I'm facing, that would be a giant step forward. Because what tends to happen, as you probably know, is we tend to look at an event and we solve that event and not worry about what happens down the road. And so that's why organizations often say, well, we're working with a very siloed mentality. Well, you're working with a siloed mentality because you're not taking a systems thinking approach to this problem solving, right? And so I think that you need to be able to influence the thinking of senior leaders if you hope to have this entrenched in the organization. But to your earlier point, it is very time consuming. It is very difficult. It can become very complex. And you need to take incremental steps. The other thing I will say is when I talk about leadership, I talk about the 3 things that I feel are relevant. So, I take that approach.
They're not the only way.
They're not the only way, and there are many other things that you could be talking about. So I talk about vision and purpose. I talk about relationships, and I talk about systems thinking so that I provide them with a fundamental framework. But you could talk about culture. You could talk about the technology. You could talk about coaching. You could talk about change management. So where is it that you think the work needs to be done? Because there's a system at play there somewhere. Right? And you need to be able to plot that system to be able to deal with those elements.
Little pitch for you. Are you, before we get back to this, are you the kind of guy who likes to come into an organization, take sort of a top-down approach and say, here's my 60-minute talk, here's my 45 minutes, I'll send you the documents, by the way, pick up my signed copy of my book at the back and off you go? Or are you the kind of guy who actually wants to peel back the layers with an organization and dig in much deeper?
So or
maybe you do both.
I actually like to do both, but one of the things I like about going in as a keynote speaker is that I can be very idealistic. I don't have to tailor my talk to the audience that I'm dealing with because I like to be idealistic, and I suspect that you do as well. So I do like that approach, and I don't only target leaders in the organization. I'm very happy to share my presentation with frontline staff because I think frontline staff, as I said to you before, I think they're also responsible for leadership behaviors and they need to understand what this is all about. But I'm quite willing to work on an individual level with people, but to your point, people don't always call me back because it is a lot of work. And they say, yeah, this is good stuff, and let me read your book and I'll think about it.
Right.
Right? because in the meantime, we have all these other business issues to deal with.
Well, I think, I mean, my focus is primarily been nonprofits for the past probably 8 or 10 years, and a recent book that I've read for the second time, Forces for Good, which is an excellent read for anyone really doing any kind of, I would think, systems thinking or organizational analysis of one kind or another, because really it seems to me, you still got people involved in nonprofits and for-profits, and so you're still really largely dealing with a lot of the same issues. But one of the things they talk a great deal about is kind of just kind of butting your head against the everyday. We got way too much to do here. I mean, we don't have time for this. This is wonderful in theory, but how's it actually going to affect the business that we do on the ground? Or how's it going to affect my 12 people on my business development team or my sales team or whatever the case might be, or my fundraisers, to go into a nonprofit sector. So we get so busy with the day-to-day that we can't, you can't see forest for the trees kind of stuff.
I think that's a valid point, but David, I think you'd agree that simply doing your job is not enough anymore. And so if people don't have purpose, right?
Yep.
And I think that's the common element. Like
Right.
people sometimes
Right.
say to me, okay, so you got a team, like how come we're not working well together? Well, do you have a common purpose?
Yeah.
Because if you're just doing your job for the sake of doing your job, that's simply not enough, because your purpose has to align itself with the corporate vision. And again, this sounds very cliche, very much a cliche as well, but people have to remind people of what's important, right? And if I don't see purpose in the work that I'm doing and how it contributes to the bigger picture, you will not get an engaged workforce. There's a lot of talk about how do we engage people. Well, if people don't have purpose, they're not going to be engaged.
So I'm thinking of an article I read recently. Maybe it's just some thinking I've been doing recently or a conversation, but I'm sure there's going to be a lot more writing on this over the next 5, 10, 15 years. But this whole idea of that Facebook-like culture, the millennial generation that are saying, I only really want to work for you for 3 to 5 years because you're not going to continue to challenge me, or I need more money, or I want more of an exciting adventure. I want to do something where I'm giving back.
Right.
I don't want to just make large sums of money. etc. And I'm wondering to what degree that's affecting current levels of leadership, systems thinking, and organizational behavior, and so on, from a relational perspective.
Well, I think again, that's a very good question, and I think it is affecting it from a relational perspective to the extent that I need to be in constant conversation with these people to make sure that their purpose is still valid. So, as a millennial, if I use that as an example, if after 5 years my purpose is no longer fulfilling, it's incumbent on the leader in the formal leadership position to say, maybe you need a different purpose. Maybe I need to give you a bigger challenge. Maybe you need to step into another role.
There's a lack of flexibility there. There's a closed-mindedness on the sense of the leader, I suppose, at some point. Like what I've been finding of late, and I don't want to get too cynical, but just I would almost call it, here we are sitting in a room with a closed door, but the closed door policy. This is the way I've done it, so why bother changing? And that's almost become a cliche, and you kind of go, well, hang on, we're in the 21st century. Nobody really believes that anymore, do they? But I think the truth is they do.
No, I think you're right, David.
And why do we acquiesce towards what's easy,
Well, because it's a lot easier to run the business if I can act as a dictator.
Right.
Dictatorships are far more efficient
Yes.
Than democracies.
Yeah.
So if I can say, this is the way I want things done, and don't ask me any questions. And by the way, that culture still exists out there.
Oh.
That's pretty sad. I had a very eye-opening experience as a manager and this was going back 20 years. And the guy above me asked me to write a letter on his behalf, and on the bottom of the letter I said, under his signature, please call me if you have any questions. He looks at the letter and he says, I don't want this guy calling me. He says, take that sentence out. Have him call the adjudicator or whatever. Like it was like, don't ask me to call me.
I don't really want to get
That's
involved.
right. I don't really want to answer any questions. I just
funny.
want to, and this mentality still exists out there.
Yeah. Well, and I think the tragic thing, if we can go with your assumption that we're all leaders, and I do go with that assumption, by the way, what is now being communicated from that second-rate level of leadership to the other frontline person, who then potentially, if they don't fight back enough, if they acquiesce towards what's easy and so on, then aren't they going to be just communicating the same message down the road? So it's almost like this, I don't know if you've seen the film Magnolia, but it's the sins of our fathers that we pass on from, one generation to the next. And I think from a leadership perspective, I wonder to what degree there's a systemic thread to broken corporate culture.
Well, I think...
Or any relationship, frankly.
Well, sure. But to put it in a sort of another example, it's really modeling behavior. At the end of the day, depending on how you're mentored and the behavior that you model will determine your leadership style. So fundamentally, I think it's pretty obvious. If I'm brought up in a very dictatorial culture where I'm not encouraged to ask questions, and I get promoted to a management position one day, chances are very good that I'm going to model that behavior because that's what's been working for the past 5 years. Even if our business results are mediocre because nobody cares about kicking it up to the next level, that's the current culture. And by the way, it takes 10 to 15 years to change the culture of an organization, even if you set out methodically to change it, right? Because it requires a change in mentality, it requires a change in beliefs, it requires a change in behaviors. And that all takes time.
Is it, I want to get back to the idea of leadership and the new approach. And I want to come back to this and measuring it. Coming out of an international development background, it's all supposedly now about results-based management and about saying, here are my indicators, here are my outcomes. Did we actually achieve what we set out to do? Can we come back to that in a second?
Sure.
10 to 15 years to change a culture. It's connected for sure to this whole idea of impact because typically I think most investors, most people who want to see results want pretty immediate results. They're not interested in the 10 to 15 year impact statement or change, the long-term effective change. So you got a massive organization like Apple or UNICEF or World Vision, from the nonprofit perspective, or AstraZeneca. How does somebody, way down the chain, way down the ladder, actually have an impact, affect change? How do you get up in the morning going, I'm going to take this bull by the horns?
Yeah.
Even though maybe you're fighting against a system of leadership that's not necessarily open to the idea that in 10 to 15 years we're going to shift this culture. So you're moving this cruise ship, but you're not necessarily doing it together yet.
Yes, and to your point, it's a very good point. I mean, you have to be able to do it together in order to move the cruise ship. But I do believe, and I think I mentioned earlier, that you can create or make a change at a subculture level in spite of the organizational culture. And so once again, this is why I think that frontline managers, the people who actually oversee the people doing the work, have such a tremendous impact. Sadly, I think it's one of the toughest jobs in any organization because you're trying to make changes at the frontline level, and then you also have this prevailing organizational culture that can be crushing in some ways, right? Because you aren't able to move that, up the chain. But I think it was Marcus Buckingham who said that people are loyal to individuals; they're not loyal to organizations.
That's good. Yeah,
right?
It's good. Well, and it's so interesting. That's a great line because the when you hear somebody say, "Oh, I hate that company," or "I just don't want to work with them," what they're actually saying is usually not the company, but an individual that they worked with at the company, right?
Yes, and that's why they end up leaving.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. They butted heads or whatever the case might be, or you phone the customer service line and you get somebody who's not willing to budge.
Yeah.
And now you don't like this, service provider, period.
Yeah.
When they've got 800 employees.
Yeah.
And have been in business for 50 years, right? Yeah.
And I think this is also self-evident, and I'm sure you've come across this before. I mean, the higher up the corporate chain you go, the less you require technical skills and the more you require relational skills.
Yeah, for sure.
Work gets done through relationships, especially at upper management, if I can put it that way.
Yeah.
And some people are very comfortable with a dictatorial style. I mean, this is the way it's going to be, end of story. And if you can live in that culture, that's fine.
And isn't there, I don't know, I think there's a certain security in it because it's less risky, it's not as open-ended. I know what to expect coming in tomorrow morning. I know that I'll probably be asked to work a bit of overtime twice a month. You know what I mean? Like there's this level, you can almost plan your life around that style probably of leadership, whereas the other approach is way more, we used the word flux earlier, but it's constantly in a state of flux. But to me, that's exciting.
For the long term, it is. But to your earlier point, it's also riskier, right?
Yes.
It takes time.
Yeah.
You have to invest a lot of time, a lot of conversation. But over the long term, because our workforce is they're made up of intelligent people who need to know and need to have information. I think that that's the way you have to go. And to your earlier point as well about results, people, of course, want to see results. But if you're happy with mediocre results, and some people are, right? Maybe that style of leadership will survive.
So let's talk about results for a second. So donors who give money to nonprofits who are working in Africa or Southeast Asia want to be able to say, look what we did with our money, whether it's a Canadian donor or whether it's a corporate donor or whether it's individual. We all want to know that if we're going to give to the nonprofit sector, we want to know that our money is being used wisely.
Sure.
And there's an ethic that applies to corporations that doesn't apply to nonprofits and vice versa. And I'm not sure why that is, but that's probably another podcast I feel in the making. How do you say to somebody that in 10 years you're going to start to see the impact of this when they're paying X amount of dollars today, and get them to invest appropriately and not just financially, but you said time and time again, this is a commitment. This is long term. This is collective. This can be done individually, but we got to do this in a community. We need to do this in relationship and so on. So just wondering what some of your comeback statements are for that, or what are some of the stats out there saying this is going to make a huge difference.
And I don't think that's an unreasonable expectation. And then actually that's the $1 million word. It's actually expectations, clearly defining your expectations, and having a game plan so that people understand exactly where you intend to be in 5 years, 10 years. What steps am I going to take? What results can I expect? Because at the end of the day, I think that people have a right to know, are we making progress? Are we heading in the right direction? And so we need some very tangible things to put in place, right? I'm not saying that you should actually approach this as if it were a religious experience and take it on faith, especially if you don't know someone from Adam. So have a concrete plan in place, clearly define the expectations, outline your milestones, and see if you're headed in the right direction. But you have to have a clearly defined purpose / vision. And I think a vision at a strategic level, I think purpose more at the front line. I think you really have to work at the relationships and understand exactly what you expect from these relationships. And I think you have to take a systemic approach to problem solving.
I think part of the problem with this kind of measuring is that when we say the word measure, and this goes back to my question about your the Cartesian edge to your systems thinking approach. I think when we say measurement, we think numbers and we think quantifiable stats. So I want to be able to reduce you or this situation to a number. And we can't do that all the time, and yet we still seem to live our lives as if we can. And most of the distinctions that we really need to understand better are qualitative,
yes.
I think.
Yes.
How do you and I interact? How do we actually work together? Well, of course, we could do a baseline study together today, and then in a year's time, come back and do another study and say, well, look, Frank and David have improved by 1 point. Well, isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
We got our money's worth.
Yeah.
We could do that.
Yeah.
But the truth is maybe we didn't.
No.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's an intangibility to all of this that's, my favorite word is troubling, I think. But I always say it with a smile. It is troubling.
Well, it is troubling for people who need something tangible. You're right, because it's not always measurable. Right?
Yeah.
And so at the end of our meeting today, since I've only had the pleasure of meeting you today, we'll have a good sense of whether our relationship is on the right track or not.
Yeah,
right?
no, I think you're right about that.
There won't be a 7 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10 or whatever.
That's right.
But we will have a sense.
We'll have a sense
right.
intuitively, which is I think is brilliant and wonderful, and it's a type of knowledge that unfortunately our culture, for the most part, it seems, doesn't value in the way that we value that mathematical, quantitative sort of analysis. You know, and I think that's frankly part of the reason why you're busy. Why do you do the work that you do? Because you've got to break through those layers.
Well, mental models is what I call them, and certainly the layers. But to your point as well, before it escapes me, is if you're concerned only about what gets done rather than how it gets done, then you're very likely going to be very comfortable with a more dictatorial approach, for lack of a better term, which may upset some people that I actually put it that way, but I have seen it. Let's use directional. I think directional is much less offensive. So I have a directional style of leadership, and I don't care how the work gets done. End of story. But I think that relationships are important, and relationships speak to the how, and I think that's why we need to raise the level of our game.
We believe it or not, we got to come to the end of our chat today soon. but are good leaders just good people?
I think that, I don't think that you necessarily need to be. That's an interesting question. Now,
I think the reason I ask it is I was in a conversation not long ago, and somebody had read a 300-page book and reduced it. And of course, reductionism is problematic on a whole lot of levels.
Yes, it is.
But kind of reduced it to, I think the message at the end of the 392 pages was, leaders are just good people.
Yeah,
like they have a sense for other people. They're kind. Yeah. They're considerate. They leave their doors open because they want to include people. They laugh, Sure. And no, we didn't get into a long conversation, but I just thought it was kind of interesting that this was the conclusion.
David, why I hesitated to answer that question as I reflect on it, and to your point, depending on how you define good leader, you don't necessarily have good people who are good leaders. It depends on your definition of what constitutes good leadership.
Yeah, sure.
I would agree with you. I would hope that a good person also is a good leader.
Right.
But that's not necessarily always the case.
Yeah. Or the good leaders, like good could go both ways.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah. So what's the title of your new book?
Well,
do you know yet?
Yes, I actually do. I'm calling it Thinking Beyond the Perimeter, Leadership, Relationships, and Systems Thinking. And the reason I use perimeter is because mental models and the mental model of leadership establishes certain perimeters, and we need to think beyond the perimeter. And that's why the premise is thinking about our thinking. So we need to go beyond the perimeter that's been established by our thinking, our current thinking, so that we can take a more enlightened approach to leadership, if I can put it that way.
Will the book be available on Amazon, or will it be on your site? How is it?
As we speak, I just have the manuscript. I'm getting an editor, and I'm not really sure how I move forward from here.
Right,
I've never written a book before, so I'm learning as we go along.
Sure.
But I think it's going to be self-published.
Okay.
And I probably will use it in conjunction with my keynote speaking.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, makes sense. Well, thanks for joining us today, Frank. And for those of you who are interested in checking more out about what Frank is up to, it's franksoriano.com, FrankSoriano.com.
Yeah.
Leadership, Relationships, and Systems Thinking. We've had lots to chat about today. Barely scratched the surface once again. Clearly more going on than meets the eye. And keep in touch with Frank. Sign up probably a newsletter. Do you have a newsletter?
No, not yet.
Check out his site if you're interested in his book. I'm sure it'll be up there soon. And again, Frank, thanks for joining us today.
David, thanks so much. I really enjoyed our conversation today. Thank you.